Hello and welcome to Lowy Institute Conversations, a podcast in which Lowy Institute researchers and leading experts delve into the big issues in international affairs. I'm Sam Roggeveen, Director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute, and with me is Dan Flitton, Managing Editor of the Lowy Institute's online magazine, The Interpreter. This episode's part of an occasional series in which Dan and I discuss some of the important articles appearing on The Interpreter over the past week. Hi, Dan.
Hey, mate. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, we thought we'd start this week with a piece that I contributed on the Pukpuk Treaty, although there were several articles on that agreement. This is a new security agreement between Australia and PNG, which the government claims is the first new treaty, or is it the claim that this is the first alliance that Australia has struck in 70 years?
Yeah, which is an interesting claim, given that the security treaty, the short-lived security treaty that Australia had with Indonesia in the 1990s, was also, in a sense, was an alliance. I'm not sure, but it certainly had some security treaty elements to it. So, yeah, first big alliance. That's what they're claiming. And look, rather than me give you a summary of your article, Sam, why don't you tell us what you think?
Look, on the treaty itself. First of all, just to point out that there's a good lesson here for all of us about the way we read media, because about 2 weeks ago, the fact that the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, would go to Port Moresby for a signing of this agreement and then to not have it happen, that was treated as a major embarrassment for the PM. In retrospect, of course, it was a bump in the road, and it was signed just a couple of days ago as we speak in Canberra. Now, of course, we didn't know that at the time, but they do say that you can learn more from reading the newspapers that were printed a year ago rather than reading the ones that were printed last night, and that's just because that offers you a little bit of perspective, and so it is a worthwhile caution to withhold judgment on some of these things before we draw major conclusions about what turned out to be passing events.
I'd just jump in though quickly. I mean, I think you're right, and I don't want to defend old colleagues too much that I used to work with in the media, but I do think it was embarrassing for Albanese to go. Whether it was a major embarrassment, big foreign policy failure, no, but I do think that it's not a great look for Australia to go over there, to have briefed and be expecting to sign this treaty and then have it come apart. I mean, whose fault was that? It probably was a failing on the PNG side, which is the tenor of some of the articles that we've had, in terms of it was just difficult among the period of their 50th anniversary celebrations to get a cabinet together for a quorum. But they were intending to sign the agreement. So I don't think we should just brush that aside entirely as a speed bump.
Yeah, good point. Look, just to summarize my own argument, my perspective on this was just to say, don't read this as a security treaty or a defense treaty in the kind of traditional or conventional sense. So the gold standard here is NATO. And the example that I gave, the sort of slightly abstracted example that I gave in the article, was just to say, well, if you're a Frenchman and you think about what's the best way to defend France, is it on the French border or on the German border? Then the clear and obvious answer is, well, you do it on the German border because it's further away and it gives you a bit more defense in depth. And then equally, if you're a German and you say to the German, well, what's the best way to defend Germany? Should we do it alone or should we do it with the French? Again, the answer is obvious. You do it with the French because they just give you that much more capability than you would ever be able to muster by yourself. So therein you have a clear and obvious example of where two states naturally will pool their resources because they are stronger together than they are separately. The PNG-Australia treaty is not that kind of treaty. It is not a case of where two countries coming together are stronger than they are separately. PNG, by the Prime Minister's own admission, doesn't add a great deal of military capability to what Australia can already muster. This is really an agreement from the Australian perspective about what it can prevent, and what it prevents, or at least what it makes slightly less likely, is China's intrusion into the region. Australia can never keep China out entirely. But what we're doing is just, I guess, threading together the various sinews of our inherent regional strengths in order to make it that much more difficult, create more barriers to enduring Chinese strength in the region. Because the further away we can keep China, at least in a strategic and defence sense, the better off Australia will be, because it's just a huge natural advantage to Australia to be geographically distant from China. In defence terms, it's much easier for us to defend ourselves that way. So the further we can keep them away, the better.
I think the strategic big picture that you outlined there is exactly the reason for Australia to get into it. But let's look at some of the grubby politics, which I still think are potentially speed bumps in the way here. So Ollie Naboto, our colleague at Lowy Institute, has written a piece which will come out by the time the podcast is through, where he talks about PNG should ratify this treaty. So yes, they've signed it, but it's not yet ratified. So it's got to get through PNG's parliament. And you could point back to past examples, and this isn't the treaty that you're talking about from the 1970s, but just in the mid-2000s, there was an enhanced cooperation program that was a security deal that PNG and Australia signed that did get through the parliament, but then it was challenged in the PNG Supreme Court and it was ruled to be unconstitutional. So I just think that there's going to be a few political hurdles yet that Marape is going to have to get through. He's at the moment got the numbers in the parliament. He has faced down some of the no confidence motions that have bedeviled PNG politics over the time. But I still think that there's still some sovereignty sensitivities. And Ollie's piece is a really forthright argument against seeing this as somehow encroaching upon PNG's sovereignty. From Ollie's perspective, this is PNG exercising its sovereignty by building its capacity with Australia. But I think from an Australian perspective, the other element that we need to consider in all of this is, and I picked up on you using the term slightly in terms of being able to stop China's ambitions in the region. And I think that that's something that we're going to have to get used to. Penny Wong talks about a permanent contest that Australia has in the region. And I think what this sort of a treaty does is it potentially ups the stakes in terms of the bidding war that might come about for the countries that for other countries being involved in the region. So we were very critical, Australia was very critical for a long time of the so-called checkbook diplomacy that China and Taiwan were practicing across the Pacific in order to sort of try and buy recognition, diplomatic recognition for a time. But in a way, we're out now practicing our own checkbook diplomacy in trying to make sure that we keep countries on side. And I think that this treaty is part of that. Yes, it's our geography to take up the point that you are alluding to in terms of the strategic situation in which Australia finds itself. It's much cheaper for Australia to be able to see off China than try and build up a military capacity that would see off China in this way. But equally, the other side is that it's very cheap for China to go around and to mess in our region and to stir up trouble and then have us respond with a massive commitment like we're making here with PNG.
Yeah, it's a very good point. So let's stay in the region, Dan, and just highlight another, not just a single piece, but actually you pull it together into a thread about Indonesia. We've had several recent pieces about Indonesia, and the theme there is around the steps and missteps of the Prabowo administration. And particular emphasis on this signature scheme of providing free lunches to students around Indonesia.
Yeah. And look, I'd love to say that this was a deliberate and carefully planned editorial choice by which I set out in order to look at our largest neighbour to try and understand what's going on in Indonesia. In truth, I had a happy coincidence of a number of very strong analysis that were filed in that happened to come together. But it did strike me that when you pull all these threads together, that there is quite a bit going on in Indonesia. So we know for a couple of months ago there was protests that broke out in Jakarta over the largesse that the politicians were awarding themselves. That sort of evaporated a bit, and I think that there was a sense that, oh well, it's just protest season in Indonesia; it comes and goes, and that this was another case of that. But I see. I really recommend people to read Hillman, another one of our colleagues, Hillman Paol's piece on the economic missteps that Prabowo has made. And he's quite telling in the way in which he pulls apart what's been now almost a year of Prabowo's time in government. And what was really interesting is that, yes, the signature food program has run into all sorts of problems, and it's a massive undertaking. I mean, it's not surprising. The government defends it by saying it's a tiny percentage of the meals that are affected. They're trying to hand out so many million meals every day, and that there's only been a 0.0001% or something like this number of meals that have led to food poisoning and led to kids being hospitalised and all sorts of things. But the return point on that is, well, if you're going to give these meals to people and not force them to eat it, but if you're providing it to students, then there should be a 0.000. It should just be no risk at all. But what really fascinated me too is Erin Cook did me a piece. It was actually a few weeks back now, but it's one that's really stuck with me because she wrote about the way in which cartoons or a cartoon figure in Indonesia has become an emblem for the protests. And this draws from a manga cartoon, which I confess I didn't know anything about. It's called One Piece. It's been running since 1999. My youngest son loves it. He knew all about it when I talked to him. But it's the symbol of the Jolly Roger. It's about straw-hatted pirates overthrowing the evils of the world government. And it's become a symbol that's been adopted in Indonesia, flying this cartoon Jolly Roger. And it's actually spread right the way around the world. So there's been examples of it in Thailand. There's been examples of it apparently in resistance in Myanmar. It's in Madagascar. They've had it in Paris. It's one of these, I think, probably internet-fueled and maybe moment in time examples of a trend. But in Nepal, it was the symbol that was adopted by the Gen Z protesters that then led to the overthrow of the Prime Minister there. So it's just fascinating the way in which people can gravitate around a particular symbol and then use that as a way of sort of drawing together a range of discontents.
That's interesting. I hadn't read that piece, and I wasn't aware of the phenomenon. It's a reminder to me of something I've been thinking about for a while now, which is that as much as people worry about globalization as a force for creating a kind of monoculture and for reducing, putting downward pressure on sort of local diversity, I wonder if we're underestimating the power of the internet in that regard, and that actually this process of creating a global monoculture has barely started, and that this is an early example of where you see cultural trends crossing all sorts of unusual and unexpected barriers.
Yeah. No, it's a really interesting one. I do think that these things come and go to an extent. During the Thailand protests a while ago, the three-finger symbol that was in the Hunger Games was often deployed by protesters as a rallying call as well. And umbrellas in Hong Kong, another good example of the way in which the symbols can be adopted. So that's not in itself new, but yeah, I think it's really good. I find these sorts of pop culture references and the way in which pop culture impacts on politics really fascinating.
Yeah, me too. I did want to say something about the broader economics of that Indonesia thread that you've pulled together on the interpreter, and you'll find it if you scroll down the homepage. You'll find I think it's 5 articles, Dan, that you've collected together
Yeah,
there.
yeah. And look, there's been more on Interpreter too. One of these
Right.
things is one of the great things.
The one thing that occurred to me is just the level of state intervention in the Indonesian economy. It's not as if Indonesia ever fully embraced neoliberalism or the so-called Washington Consensus. It's always been, for instance, one of the most protectionist economies in Southeast Asia, and one of the more interventionist sort of state-led economies. But all pretense of neoliberal principle, or at least market-based principle, seems to have been put aside in Indonesia, and that's a broader trend. And of course, it's most apparent in the United States with the return of tariffs on a massive scale.
Yeah, well, we're doing it. We're doing it here in Australia too, in a way, with our own building. What do the government call it? Building Australia program, that sort of thing. The other thing too in Indonesia is, yes, they do have a heavy market hand. Sorry, a heavy government hand in the market, but there's also some amazing agility that they've demonstrated. And this is particularly around digital issues. And again, if you look at some of Hillman's earlier articles, the way in which they adopted digital payments, the Gojek and others as that gig economy, the way in which that developed in Indonesia was also kind of leading in a way. So there are some examples by which they've done very well. And we have one article on there about biodiesel. And this will be controversial for some people because they hear palm plantations and they just think of the environmental costs, and that can be true, but there's an effort by the industry to find a place for itself. Indonesia and Malaysia together are the largest palm oil producers in the world, and if they can turn it into a biodiesel, they see that as an environmental contribution.
But is it just to illustrate how, I guess, if you like, deconstructed this whole environment is at the moment? You've just published a piece moments ago, I think, as we speak, by Henry Story, about a trade deal, a free trade agreement between Europe and Indonesia. So there are some sort of free trade instincts on both sides that are still coming through. And yet, as you read through Henry Story's piece, you also see that this thing is going to have holes poked through it by special interest groups in Europe and in Indonesia, which are going to put paid to a lot of the sort of free trade ambitions that are designed into the agreement itself.
Yeah, there's a lovely line in Henry's piece where he talks about this has actually been driven in part by Europe wanting to convince itself that it can actually do things again, having stymied these projects for a long time. I'm not doing Henry justice there, but well worth a read.
Okay, so moving on, and this one we'll keep very brief, but I did want to mention Marcus Collar, who has written a review of a new book by Patrick Porter about in defense of realism as a foreign policy idea. I don't want to say too much about the piece itself, except that you should read it. I know you also wanted to talk, Dan, about the long read piece that you published on the northernmost island of the Philippines and what it means for the fate of Taiwan.
I'm a huge fan of this idea that you can make analytical points that'll really stick with people and they'll remember them for years to come through storytelling. And this was a really fun piece that Frances put together for us, where she was able to hitch a ride, as she put it, on a Philippines military transport up to the island that is closest to Taiwan if you look north of the Philippines. And it's just fascinating, actually, just to look at the map and just to consider where these little specks, and she calls it a speck, is located, and how this might actually be such an influential territory should it ever come to blows between Taiwan and China. And she tells the story about about going there and what it was like to see it. We gave her some extra space to tell this story, so it ran to a couple of thousand words. People that are reading the Interpreter regularly will know that most of our articles, we try and keep them deliberately short. And the idea there, and I say this to my authors all the time, it's not to punish the authors, it's to reward the readers. And our hope there is that people are busy. We don't want them to look at the Interpreter and say, oh, no, I really like the Interpreter, but I need 30 minutes to go and properly read an article. I don't have that time. I'll come back to it later. And then they never do. We want them to say to themselves, and it doesn't sound like long, but you've got to think about your own reading habits. Oh, I've got a few minutes now. I'll just scan the Interpreter. I'll just see what's running at the moment, and then they might invest in an article. With these occasional long reads, and we're trying to do roughly one a week or one a fortnight thereabouts, it's a couple of thousand words or maybe more to really tell a story about some of these international issues. And we've run a few now on the Philippines. We've run one on PNG. We've run some on scam centres that we're running in India. They've proved really popular so far. So my challenge is to try and get more of them.
Just finally, Dan, with the little time we have left, I know you wanted to throw some light on an article that we published, which is perhaps overlooked, but is really important in terms of Australia's democratic institutions and democratic norms. It's a piece about the role of the High Court and the way that the Parliament and also the executive can effectively override High Court decisions. And more broadly, it's an article about what that means for the way Australia promotes democratic norms among its neighbours.
Yeah, in a roundabout way, although I didn't follow the specifics of this particular case that Juan Caceres has written for us on, it's known as the NZYQ case. I had followed, when I was a reporter some years ago, earlier High Court decisions that related to what they'd called indefinite detention. And it always shocked me personally that Australia could have a system where people could effectively be put into detention and have the key thrown away. Because in that case, these were people that had come to Australia that had been granted, they'd come to Australia as asylum seekers, they'd been granted refugee status. They couldn't be returned to their own country, but ASIO, the security organisation, had made an adverse finding against them. A lot of these people were Tamils and that sort of thing. I thought that was doubly unfair because, for one thing, the finding couldn't be appealed, but nor could it either be disclosed. It was unfair to the person involved, but it was also unfair to the ASIO analyst who has to make this determination knowing that their decision is effectively going to confine someone to a life in detention. And that's not the system that we should have set up in this country. That's for the courts to decide. So when it went to the High Court and then it was knocked down as being unconstitutional, what then happened, and where Juan, I think, explains it really well, is that the government or the Parliament then changed the law so they could continue the rights abuse. They just did it differently. And so by the time it goes back to the High Court again, well, we're playing a kind of whack-a-mole or a cat and mouse game, is what he called it. And I thought that this was about the best case that I've read. And I've read some mushy legal arguments about the need for a Bill of Rights in Australia. And frankly, I've never been persuaded by them because they often feel like, oh, the lawyers always win. And this is a good job for the lawyers. But to me, this was an example, and he picked up on this NZYQ case and what's happened to some of these people have now been shipped off to Nauru, just as an example of the way in which Australia was actually contradicting the message that it sends internationally in terms of supporting rights. So another one that I'd commend to people.
Yeah, I had the same reaction. I must say I've been a real skeptic about a Bill of Rights in Australia, but this is the first piece I've read that at least brought me a little bit closer to understanding and accepting the argument.
One is as he told me, he's from Colombia, and it just got me thinking that sometimes it takes people from outside who haven't grown up in the ferment that you're just kind of accepting and, oh, well, that's just the way things are. He's from outside. He was shocked that this would be the case, and he's studied in Australia for a long time now. He's got several degrees and he's working up in UQ. It's a really great piece.
Thanks, Dan. That's all the time we have for you today. Links to all the articles mentioned in today's podcast will appear in the show notes. You've been listening to Lowy Institute Conversations, a podcast hosted by Institute experts and produced by Josh Gotting. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode. Bye for now.